Although Citroen isn't typically the kind of brand you would put in the same sentence as the word badass, they actually do have more than a few vehicles throughout their history which have not only had amazing innovations, but which are really cool, sometimes in terms of design, maybe performance, and sometimes just some wild ideas that maybe didn't come to fruition, but were still pretty cool at least on paper. Previously we've talked about Lamborghini, Peugeot, Volkswagen, and this time I'm turning my attention to Citroen. And as always, of course, if you think that there is a super badass Citroen which I've missed, of course you could drop it down in the comments, but for now, let's get straight into the 15. First up is a vehicle which for me always comes to mind when I think of really cool Citroens, especially ones which most people don't talk about, called the C Matisse. Many people know of the GT by Citroen, which of course is their only supercar in the truest sense. The C Matisse though, although looking like a supercar, or at least a super shooting brake if you will, isn't really one in practice. It was designed though to show that a hybrid could be an attractive car, an appealing car. It's of course a 5-door, technically, shooting brake 2+2 style, and has a combination of a V6 engine and 2 electric motors as well. It's not the quickest of things, it's got about 250 horsepower, 0 to 60 in around 6 seconds with up around 40 miles to the gallon of average economy, so in terms of practicality and performance, it's more like a hot hatch you could say, or maybe a sports saloon, but visually speaking it's a very striking looking car, and even though it never came to fruition, well, to me it's a perfect way to kick off the list. Next up we have a car which is most certainly badass, and for some of you might well be your favourite one on the list, even if you already knew about it. It is of course based on the SM, already a badass car from back when Citroen owned Maserati. This was a Maserati powered Citroen already. This one though is the Michelin Bread van, which doesn't really sound like that cool of a car, but it actually is, because to this day it's still one of the most badass front wheel drive cars ever made. It has a 340 horsepower engine, barely weighs 1100 kilos, and is still a front engine front wheel drive car. It can do 180 miles an hour, which means that even by today's standards this is still one of the quickest front drivers around. It is definitely one of the single most badass cars Citroen have ever made. Moving on from this idea of their more classic comfort-based lines being turned into something much more crazy, this one of course will be familiar to some of the OG fans of Unsung Heroes. It's the Citroen PLR, or the Milat, or Centipede as it's often called, a 10-wheeled, 9.5-ton, 24-foot long, 8-foot wide, roughly 21,000-pound monster of a car with 2 engines making a total of 14.9 litres, 16 cylinders, and somewhere up around 800 or 900 combined horsepower. Only one of those engines drives the wheels though, so don't expect it to be a supercar in terms of performance. It can do 110 miles an hour or so, but this one was of course built to test tyres. Much like the previous vehicle, the SM Michelin was initially purposed and primarily purposed to test high-performance Michelin tyres. This one is as well, but not so much high-performance tyres, more so truck tyres. It has a test bed within the vehicle which can lower and raise a large truck tyre to the road, and that second engine is just to operate that inner tyre testing. All of those numbers don't come together into a hypercar, but it's still a pretty badass vehicle, and believe it or not, you can actually buy scale models of this thing, which I would love to own. Maybe I'll get one at some point, but that's got to be one of the biggest models you can buy, especially in 1/18 scale. That thing must be massive. To stay on topic with Unsung Heroes, the next one will of course be familiar. This is one of the OG episodes, in fact, in the Unsung Heroes series, one of my favourite Citroens, and it actually means that all 3 of the major French manufacturers have their own super badass version of a people carrier. Renault has the Espace F1, Peugeot has the 806 Procar, and of course Citroen has the Picasso Cup. It wasn't actually built by Citroen, it was built by Sbarro, and in terms of its livery, its design, its construction, even its power plant, it's very much so inspired by kit rallying. So 2-litre engine, it's bored out from a standard size, turbo aspirated to about 235 horsepower, so it's not as quick as the Peugeot, certainly not the Renault Espace F1, but a super cool car in its own way. It's got crazy doors, 4 seats still, and although not technically being built by Citroen, it's definitely one of the most badass things you could possibly do with an otherwise fairly mediocre looking car. The next one is one of the newest examples of a vehicle on the list, and I would wager that out of all of the ones here, you've probably seen this one before, maybe in a certain game here or there, or even again on Google Images or in Top Gear magazine perhaps. The DS, so of course the slightly more upmarket wing of Citroen if you will, E10s concept. Now what some people might not know is there are actually 2 versions of this one. There's the initial version of the E10s, which I personally find to be a way better looking car, which was a 400 horsepower all electric, essentially supercar kind of, or sports car at the very least concept. And after that initial 2016 version, later in 2022 they presented the DS E10s Performance, which has 608 kilowatts of all-electric power, of course with all-wheel drive as well, and what that means in terms of horses is an 815 horsepower DS. It didn't reach production, of course, but man, that would have been a pretty awesome kind of modern-day equivalent of something like a Venturi. Of course, not in the literal sense, but kind of this idea of a top-tier French sports or supercar that could have been a cool way of handing off the baton. The next car has had a bit more of a resurgence thanks to games like Forza Horizon 5, where it is available in the game as an additional vehicle after the game's release. It is, of course, the Citroen BX4TC. This is one of those cars which, even in the world of rallying, is very, very obscure. Its best finish was a 6th place in the Swedish rally, but in road form, it's still just as much of a badass car as many of the other super rare homologation specials. This car had 4-wheel drive. There were only about 62 originally sold, only about 30 of them are still around, so it is ultra rare, but it was still a great performance car, at least on paper, with about 380 horsepower in rally form and about 200 horsepower in road form. So not bad at all. 4-wheel drive, 200 horses from a turbo aspirated engine. That sounds pretty cool for a car which most people don't really talk about at all. It's not quite as quick as some of the other icons of the time, and certainly not as easy to find. Not that any of them are that easy to find these days, but pretty damn cool car nonetheless. Staying in the world of rallying though, we next up have probably one of my favourites on this list, up there with the Citroen SM Michelin Bread van. This one is based on one of the most unassuming Citroens ever, the Citroen Visa. It's not the kind of car which you'd ever see and go, man, I really want one of those, and typically we're talking about a car which in its normal form only has around a 650cc engine, so it's about a hair away from being essentially a French equivalent of a Japanese K car. This version though was very special indeed, because it's called the Citroen Visa Lotus. When we say it's Lotus, it is quite literally Lotus, because the entire chassis, even the mid-mounted 2.2 litre turbo engine, is literally a Lotus Esprit with a Citroen Visa wide body on top of it. So a 210 horsepower Citroen Visa that weighs barely 1,000 kilos, or a ton in other words. What an absolute little monster of a car, and like I said, definitely one of the most badass ones here. Staying on the topic of the Visa though, and this one, don't get too excited, is definitely nowhere near as extreme as that, but in its own way it's at least a bit more attainable, the Visa GT Tonic. From what I could find, there seem to be a few different versions of the Citroen Visa in terms of GT versions, but the Tonic version, as it's called, seems to be a more specific reference to their rallying successes. It's got a 1.4 litre, roughly 80 horsepower engine. Of course, by today's standards, 10 seconds to 60 doesn't sound that crazy, but 80 horsepower in a little car, if nothing else, it would have been a lot of fun, and for its time, that would have been pretty quick. Next up is the kind of vehicle which I could easily see just popping up randomly in a Gran Turismo game like GT4 or GT7 in a legendary dealership. This is a shorter wheelbase version, again kind of like the SM from earlier on, but this time it's rally based and more specifically based on the Citroen DS. The DS had a lot of promise in rallying, but sometimes didn't quite deliver on it because of its handling and its length. So they shortened it. It's quite a lot shorter, about 60 centimeters shorter in fact, has a 190 horsepower version of its engine. The funny things about this one are, in addition to those comically large front mud flaps and the almost Marcos Mini kind of back end, which of course I'm a fan of, it still has the hydro pneumatic suspension, but perhaps the craziest thing about it was, even as a fully fledged rallying prototype, this version still has its reclining bench seat. So apparently it's not really ideal if you're trying to, for example, be the co-driver and tell people, oh, you know, 4 left over crest and all that kind of stuff, when you've got nothing to hold on to and a seat that is really not giving you any support at all. So it must have been quite comical to drive, but yeah, very cool bit of kit. The next one is one of those cars which I like to add on the list, more so from the concept car world, not because it achieved anything amazing necessarily, but just because it was kind of a cool design exercise. It's called the C Series, and more specifically the C10. From around 1955 and 1956, they produced a couple of different versions of this idea, and it was kind of a forward-thinking concept of what the future of design could be like. They nicknamed it the Ladybug at the time, based on the Citroen 2CV in part, with a 425cc engine, and it has some reminiscent styling of other cars of the time, particularly in that tiny car kind of class, you know, Messerschmitts and that kind of stuff. Not necessarily badass in terms of how the other cars on the list are, but just a cool idea, and there are 1 or 2 of those on the list. The next one is another. This one, much more crazy in terms of its design. Back around 1980, Citroen didn't really plan to show off any new show cars of production models, so instead they said, just make something that's an interesting design exercise, something that will attract more attention. So they made the Karin, a 3-seater, middle driving position, McLaren F1 style, even though the McLaren hadn't even come around yet, so I guess you could say the McLaren is Citroen Karin style. It's only 3 foot 6 inches tall, so not that much taller than a Ford GT40. In fact, it's only 12 feet long, which is about the same as a Daihatsu Syrian, so it's a very small car, and it retains front engine front wheel drive. In terms of performance, of course you wouldn't be expecting it to be quick. This, as with the previous car, is just a really wacky little idea and a wacky little design that was made because they really had nothing else to show, so why not grab some attention? Next up we have two cars back to back which are intrinsically linked to each other, and both of which suffered from kind of the same drawbacks as pretty much everyone who used this technology, because believe it or not, Citroen actually dabbled in the world of rotary engines. Back when the rotary was kind of bursting onto the scene, of course companies like NSU were immediately well known for it. Mazda would of course become the one who would really run with the idea up until relatively recently really, and who knows what will happen in the future. They always talk about bringing it back. In the case of this car though, it was called the M35, and at the time loads of different companies were scrambling to get in on this idea of the rotary engine, but Citroen had been quietly working with NSU and had essentially like half of the NSU's engine, so it was about a 500cc equivalent. Of course it's hard to say with the rotary, but that kind of region, about 50 or so horsepower. They built about 270 of these or just under, and of course ultimately they had plagues of issues on these earlier cars, and many of those issues never really got resolved even on modern Mazdas. You can only imagine they must have been way worse back then in the early days. The plan was that NSU and Citroen would each have their own kind of version of the same idea and sell it in different markets, but that didn't really quite come to plan. What did come to plan though, kind of, is the next car, the Citroen GS Birotor. This took the same essential idea of a rotary powered Citroen and had marginally more success, if you can even call it that, around the equivalent of a 1.9 litre engine or so, so a 1900cc, about 107 horsepower, 110 mile an hour car, so not bad. The problem was this thing could get about 18 miles to the gallon, which even for a classic is not very good at all. It cost 70% more than the normal models, which is a pretty hefty premium. It did though have some pretty cool ideas. Disc brakes on all four wheels, of course it had their signature suspension, semi-automatic gearbox, some cool stuff for sure. Out of those 847 built though, a lot ended up back in the garage within about 20,000 miles because of seals going. So such is the rotary, it would appear, and again certainly back then they ended up buying a lot of them back off of customers because of course these cars would have had warranties and they didn't really want to start having to shell out huge amounts of money and huge amounts of parts, so instead they took a bit of a loss, bought them back off of the customers. Many of the customers said yes, only about 250 of these remain, so as with most classic rotaries, it's in pretty high demand. Although unlike many classics, it's unfortunately one of the ones which I doubt you'd want to use that much, because it is one of those classic collector's pieces where in a very real sense, every time you drive it, you're bringing it one step closer, 1 mile closer to not being able to drive it anymore, which probably means that unfortunately most of these don't get driven very much at all, I would imagine. The next one is a vehicle which is badass more in a figurative sense, and certainly badass in terms of Citroen's roots, because this is one of the original 2CV prototypes. They built around 250 Citroen 2CVs, testing some different ideas. Of course, its original intention was to be a super affordable, very easy to maintain, completely bare bones approach for stuff like farmers to use, etc. As, you know, a family car, a produce moving vehicle, etc. Everything you need it to, but which could also take on rough terrain of the countryside. When World War II came around though, a lot of them were destroyed, but about 4 of them survived. One with Michelin, the 3 others were hidden. Dr. Porsche at the time apparently saw one of these and thought it was a joke. He found it to be a shed-built jalopy, I think he referred to it as, and it just goes to show that being smart doesn't mean that every idea you have and every remark you make is going to be intelligent, because boy was he wrong. This of course is one of the most iconic Citroens ever, one of the best-selling Citroens ever, and to this day you could put it up there with stuff like the Beetle, the Mini, and various others as well, as one of the most iconic cult classic cars of all time. And I've decided to leave definitely one of the most badass, if not the most badass, until last. Unsurprisingly, when you're talking about Citroen's greatest achievements, a lot of it is going to be based on stuff like the SM and the DS. They are iconic for a reason. This particular SM though takes the extreme of what was already a really cool idea of, as I said earlier on, a Maserati powered Citroen, and takes it even beyond what the Michelin test bread van could do, because a brand called SM World, who specialised in stripping down SMs and having parts available for customer repairs, etc., at least for the most part, they had one particular customer who had big ideas for the SM, a chap called Jerry Hathaway. He wanted to drag race them, he thought they had great aerodynamic potential, and he ended up picking up an SM which they had in. They were going to strip it down for parts, but instead they restored it and turned it into a beast. Initially it was naturally aspirated, later on it ended up being turbocharged, and every new modification made it quicker and quicker and quicker. I believe its initial run or its initial record was up around 150 miles an hour. Again, that was when it was still naturally aspirated. And then in 1985, with Jerry at the wheel, couple, it broke 200 miles an hour in turbo form, and to me the part which is even more hilarious and even more badass is that then Jerry's record was beaten in 1987 to 202 miles an hour, which of course is about 325 kilometers an hour, by Sylvia Hathaway, his wife, making them one of the very few couples to both break 200 mile an hour records. So not only was it driven by a badass couple, the idea of a Citroen SM doing 202 miles an hour in its own right is pretty awesome as well. Because Citroen is not a company, much like Peugeot, which I've spoken about before, they're not a company which tends to get as much respect as they deserve, especially when you'll have companies who'll go through a bit of a lull period of focusing on normal cars and big sales and kind of losing a bit of that, the flair that they occasionally had, or maybe the innovation of the past. Citroen's had an amazing history of innovation and some wild ideas, some of which we've talked about here, especially in the world of rallying in particular. And as I said, if there are some which you think I've missed, drop them down below and I will see you in future for a different manufacturer and a different list. But for now, thanks for watching.